afternoon, everyone. My name's Amanda. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your longtime Albuquerque independent bookstore. We've been in the North Valley of the Rio Grande River Valley in Albuquerque for 36 years this month. So thank you so much for supporting our independent bookstore. This is how we get to keep having wonderful events with some of our favorite authors, like today's author, Margaret Randall. You can order books on our website right now during the pandemic. That's Bookworks without the O's. It's BKWRKS.com. I will put a link for Margaret's book into the chat while we're doing our presentation. That way you can hop on and see if you might want to purchase a signed copy from us. Margaret Randall, one of my sheroes here in Albuquerque. I've known Margaret for quite a while now. I met her back in the days of the Albuquerque Cultural Conference, a social conference we would have here with tons of organizers and amazing writers, of which we are blessed here in New Mexico. As you probably know, Margaret is a world-traveled feminist scholar, poet, writer. She's written, I think, somewhere over 100 books now. I tend to lose track because she's one of the most prolific people I know, and she's always putting out multiple books every year. So we're blessed to be with her today. We are going to be talking about a new book that has such a cool concept. It's My Life in 100 Objects. So Margaret's going to show us some images from the book, and we will talk more about that. Margaret, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Amanda. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Bookworks, it's always wonderful to be with you. It's the only independent bookstore, I think, left in Albuquerque, right? Or certainly the most important, so.
Some new books, yes. We have some used bookstores, definitely, that are independent.
Right.
Yeah, we've got both new and used books in our store. Are you ready for me to share this screen, Madame?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Here we go.
Thank you, Amanda. So My Life in 100 Objects, in this gorgeous edition published by New Village Press in New York, is kind of a companion piece to my recently published memoir. I got the idea for this book from a book called The World in 100 Objects, written by British Museum Director Neil MacGregor and published in 2010. MacGregor's book featured items owned by the museum, the British Museum. The first was a 2-million-year-old chopping tool from the Olduvai Gorge in Eastern Africa. And the last, the most modern, was a credit card. For my book, I photographed and wrote brief text about objects and places that have shaped my life. Objects themselves become language. My first typewriter, my first camera, the metronome that accompanied my father as he played his cello during my childhood, the molds in which I've been baking bread for close to 4 decades now, a worn copy of The Joy of Cooking, the fake passport I purchased for my underground escape from Mexico in 1969, a tiny 4,000-year-old clay head from the ruins at Teotihuacan in Mexico, my turquoise earrings that I seem to wear every day, and the gold wedding bands Barbara and I have worn since we were finally able to marry legally in 2013. So these are just a few of my 100 objects. I could have probably chosen 100 very different objects, or maybe 500 objects, but I thought that 100 was a good cutoff number. And I hope that you all may think of objects that are important in your life as I share some of these chapters of the book. This book also includes some special places. So to give you an idea of the visuals, I'll show you the images as I read a selection. And the first should be familiar to people here in Albuquerque. It's object number 13, and it's called Madonna of the Trail. When I was growing up in Albuquerque in the 1940s and 50s, this monument stood in a different city park. I never did learn why it was moved. I remember walking past as a preteen, immune to its cliched presentation and unaware that phrases such as, quote, the primitive West, unquote, were colonialist at best, the unexamined discourse of an era in which I would not have known how to question such ignorant definitions. On the contrary, this Madonna of the Trail, one of several such monuments erected in Western cities, elicited a thrill of identification in me. As a young woman, I already sensed the restrictions placed on my gender. Any gesture that seemed to revere those women who preceded me and who I knew had faced painful obstacles simply in order to survive inspired an intimate pride. I remember calling this stone image the pioneer woman. I wasn't privy to a religious upbringing, and the word Madonna wasn't part of my vocabulary. No, for me, this was the pioneer woman, my pioneer woman, and for a very long time, she remained strong in my consciousness, an ugly monument giving me something I needed. So I chose that in a way because of the issue around monuments and statues today, racist monuments and statues. I thought it was interesting. Of course, I wrote it quite a bit before this issue has come up currently. Here is number 33 in the book. It's called A Piece of the Berlin Wall. As with, quote, pieces of the true cross, unquote, there's always the possibility that some object sold as pieces of the Berlin Wall might not be authentic. This one was given to me by a friend who lives in Berlin. I feel confident it is the real thing. It's encased in clear plastic. It's signage in English for tourist consumption. It doesn't measure more than an inch across. Walls keep people out or in. They symbolize the terrible divisions of these times between immigrants and locals, rich and poor, communities of different races, religions, needs. Autocratic governments want to erect more walls, keep the murderers and rapists away, they cry. As I write, Donald Trump continues to advocate for a solid, quote, sea-to-sea wall that is clearly a political ploy rather than anything remotely needed on our border with Mexico. Some of these barriers, just in my lifetime, have been the 17th parallel dividing North and South Vietnam, the Berlin Wall, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea, the wall between Israel and Palestine, the wall separating Ireland from Northern Ireland, the line between Cuba and the US-controlled Guantanamo base, and that wall on our southern border that has become such an obsession for President Trump. Today, some countries in Western Europe hastily erect walls to keep out the floods of immigrants fleeing war-torn areas of Africa and the Middle East. Others open their doors to these migrants, taking in as many as they can. When the no person's land between East and West that once ran through Berlin and much of Europe was opened up, it revealed a strip of land where birds sang among abundant vegetation. Not having been disturbed for decades, it held ecological surprises. The first act in healing the world's wounds is tearing down the walls. Number 42 causes me some shame, but it does exude my passion for ancient civilizations. It's called Turquoise Bead, Chaco. It was a hot, dry, late summer afternoon. We were walking along the base of the cliff that runs from Pueblo Bonito to Chetroquetl, two of Chaco's great houses. I looked down, and less than an inch from my right toe was a tiny turquoise bead, smaller than 0.5 centimeter in diameter. A perfect hole had been carved in its center. Once it must have been strung with other beads in a necklace or bracelet. There's a spiral striation visible around the circumference of the bead, more prominent on one side than on the other. I picked the bead up and held it in my hand. I closed my fingers around it, and images of Chacoan women adorned with turquoise and shells exploded behind my eyes. You know, you have to put it back, Barbara said. I nodded in agreement, but did nothing. When we left Chaco that day, the bead was in my Levi pocket. Years have passed. I've considered returning it to the powdery sand where I found it, but I never have. I know the rules. No artifacts or even stones must be taken from ancient sites. But I cannot bring myself to part with this bead, which whispers its stories in my ear. Number 57 is a photograph I made in Alaska some years back. It speaks of the phenomenon of global warming, which continues to be a serious concern. So this is Glacier Iceberg, Alaska.
Hey, Margaret,
Yes?
are you guys seeing this participants box in the middle of the screen?
No?
Okay.
I'm not.
I just want to make sure because I'm never quite clear on what Zoom is, what I'm seeing versus what you're seeing.
No, I see it fine.
Okay, great. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So again, this is LeConte Glacier Iceberg in Alaska. We were exploring Alaska's Inside Passage on a small ship whose captain loved getting us close enough to glaciers and waterfalls that we could reach over the deck railing and touch them, or almost. Today, when clear signs of global warming, receding glaciers, melting polar ice caps, rising seas, ferocious storms, are being discredited by many who prefer the Bible or obscene prophet to taking the necessary precautionary measures, I cannot digest the terrifying statistics. They're like the statistics of war, natural disaster, or endless migration, too overwhelming to process. I think instead of this photograph I made of delicate blue ice embracing a small pool of turquoise water. When gems like this melt, it will mean the end of the polar bear's habitat, the disintegration of shorelines, the erasure of many major cities and some entire island countries, and the loss of species and resources such as the air we breathe, rendering the earth uninhabitable. Included in this segment is a poem of mine called Cool Compresses and Non-Binding Law. Now the patient's fever spikes at dawn as well as late afternoon. Cool compresses and non-binding law do nothing to bring it down. Glaciers melt, filling valleys with oceans of salt. The patient must sleep upright. Her lungs no longer expand or retract in harmony. Teeth chattering like insulted bone, she sweats toxic waste and fracking's poison, vomits the bile of mutilated seed. The fire on her brow swallows wilderness, great cities and small towns. Branches crackle like charred veins, science fiction, a pale portrait of her agony. Preventative medicine was the only way to avoid this fatal turn. We're years past that now. Breathtaking no longer means beautiful. No morphine, hospice, or final ritual. This illness increases dangerous levels of testosterone. The patient's fever rises off the charts, her death a matter of time. Her preventable disease reaches every orphan child, every pristine landscape buried in ash, hurricane, or earthquake off the Richter scale. A pandemic of rapes and murders opens like sores on her once fertile body. Desperate migrations push through permanently clogged arteries. The patient's echoing warnings may be observed or not by some future species when oblivious time returns. So number 97, towards the end of the book, is a Storyteller Doll by Ada Suina. She's from Coche de Pueblo here in New Mexico. Storyteller dolls are fashioned by artists, usually women, at several Rio Grande Valley pueblos. The first storyteller is believed to have been made by Helen Cordero of Cochiti. Cordero started out working in leather, but switched to clay and said she produced her first doll in 1964. The origin of the figure reflects the importance of storytelling in the native tradition, but soon caught the interest of collectors and began to be seen at Pueblo fairs and in upscale Santa Fe shops. Like all native art, the statues have straddled the fine line between authentic tradition and tourist demand. Storytellers can be several feet high and have a dozen or more children clinging to them in various places and positions. I fell in love with this one, made by Ada Suina, also of Cochiti. It sits on a shelf to the right of my writing desk. Sometimes it tells me stories, but it's possible that I talk more often to it. These are only a few of the entries in this book, and I hope they've whetted your appetite for more. I'm going to end with one last chapter or entry. It's called Scissors and Typewriter Ribbon, and it's entry 98. It describes a wonderful meeting in New York a few years back of aging beat poets. There weren't that many of us left. Beat and Beyond was a delirious gathering of aging beat poets and younger people inspired by the tradition. It was organized by Bob Holman of Bowery Poetry and Science and Jane Friedman of Howell Arts, and took place in New York City in June of 2016. I was invited and was one of the few still alive and capable of traveling among those men and women who called ourselves beat poets or were loosely connected to that movement in the 1950s and 60s. Many beats were long gone. Allen Ginsberg had been dead almost a decade. Jack Kerouac since 1969. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, living and still active on the West Coast, was too old to make the trip. He was almost 100. Diane de Prima, also in San Francisco, was too ill. Michael McClure showed up, as did Hetty Jones, who still lives in New York, and a few others. Stephen Taylor, a boy when the original beats were changing America's culture, recreated the musical group The Fugs and brought back some of the iconic music of the era. Other attendees had various connections to the movement. For a week, we participated in readings, panels, and lectures. We reveled in films about some of the movement's stellar figures and attended concerts that took us back in time. The event's organizers wisely lodged us all at the Standard Hotel. All we had to do was stroll with our various walking aids a few blocks down the Bowery to take in the variety of activities. At Howell Arts, we were able to thumb through a number of books, journals, and broadsides with work by the original Beats. On a whiteboard, we lovingly wrote the names of recently departed poets and artists. One evening, we recreated Ginsberg's 1955 reading of Howell at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco. Michael McClure was the only person then alive who'd taken part in the poem's first reading. In New York, he played the part of Philip Lamantia, while Hetty Jones, at less than 5 feet, played Ginsberg. She did so with gusto. One night, we were each given a large pair of scissors with which to cut a ribbon, simulating the old red and black typewriter ribbons each of us remembered from those years. My scissors and length of ribbon are objects I treasure. As I was writing these lines, I received an unexpected phone call from Jane Friedman. She explained that Howell Arts has a jukebox in the alley behind the gallery where passers-by push buttons and get to listen to poems read by the poets who wrote them. Could they use one of mine, she asked. They'd recorded it during my reading at Beat and Beyond. The name of the poem is I Cannot Speak for the Gun. I was delighted. The best way to extend the life of a poem is hearing it in the poet's voice. The Beats keep on changing America, not only in its literary culture, but in its way of looking at the world. And this is the poem, I Cannot Speak for the Gun. I cannot speak for the gun doing its ugly job in George Zimmerman's overeager hands. I cannot speak for those 18 ounces easily concealed in a killer's pocket. Easy to guess what George's intention was. Too easy to imagine the terror in Trayvon's eyes, the grief his mother holds years beyond her loss. The law never found Zimmerman guilty or condemned his crime, and Martin could not know his death would bring a nation into the streets, or that hundreds of other Black youth would have to die, gunned down by white policemen or self-styled protectors of an order that runs by exception in this country, where law protects the men who write it, works for white, fails for Black, rich or poor, genders that matter or don't. Now George Zimmerman auctions the gun that murdered Trayvon Martin. He's asking $5,000, promises some of the money will go to fight Black Lives Matter because, simply put, they don't matter to him. Will this gun's new home turn its barrel around or lure another trigger finger in wait? I cannot speak for the gun or the men who love caressing its fever. My job is finding the words that describe the weapon's threat precisely. So those are the parts of this book that I've wanted to share tonight. And I'd love to turn this into a conversation. So if people have questions, I'd love to hear them, or comments, or maybe talk about some of your own favorite objects.